The autumn of 1847 had painted Thornwood Manor in shades of amber and gold, and tonight the grand estate blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames dancing against crystalline chandeliers as England's finest gathered for the annual charity ball. The ballroom hummed with the rustle of silk gowns and the murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by bursts of laughter that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and yet there remained one figure who existed at the periphery of all this glittering society, neither fully present nor entirely absent, a spectre draped in black who had not shown her face to the world in 10 years. Lady Celeste Ashford stood near the terrace doors where the shadows pooled deepest, her form swathed in mourning clothes that had long since ceased to mourn anyone but herself, and the black veil that fell from the brim of her hat obscured every feature save the faint outline of her chin and the pale column of her throat. She had become a fixture at such events, invited out of obligation to her family name, and accepted with the peculiar tolerance society reserved for eccentrics who knew their place, and that place was always here, in the margins, where curious eyes could observe her from a distance, while maintaining the pretense of polite disinterest. The whispers followed her like a second shadow, soft speculation about what horrors must lie beneath that opaque barrier of silk and lace, some suggesting hideous disfigurement from disease, others whispering of a tragic accident that had stolen her beauty and her prospects in one cruel stroke. And though the latter carried a kernel of truth, none of them truly knew the extent of what the fire had taken from her beyond flesh and comeliness. Celeste had learned to hold herself with a stillness that discouraged approach, her gloved hands clasped before her, her posture perfect but not inviting, and she watched the dancers swirl past in their elaborate patterns, their faces flushed with wine and pleasure, their laughter a language she had forgotten how to speak. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and the melody pierced through her carefully constructed composure, transporting her unwillingly back to another ballroom, another autumn night, when she had been young and whole, and engaged to a man who had sworn eternal devotion, before the fire that consumed her sister's chamber had spread to her own, before she had awakened in agony to find half her face ravaged, and her betrothed's love transformed to horrified pity, and then to empty air when he broke their engagement by letter, too cowardly to face what she had become. She closed her eyes behind the veil, breathing slowly through the tightness in her chest, reminding herself that this half-life was still life, that existing in the shadows was preferable to the alternative of complete withdrawal, though some nights she was not entirely certain this was true, and tonight the loneliness pressed against her ribs like a physical weight, the isolation she had chosen, feeling less like protection and more like a prison of her own construction, and she wondered, not for the first time, if she would spend the remainder of her days like this, a ghost among the living, seen but never truly known, present but perpetually alone. The murmur of conversation shifted like a sudden change in the wind when the ballroom doors opened near 9:30, and all eyes turned toward the late arrival, who stood framed in the archway with an air of a man who had learned to endure scrutiny with military precision. Duke Sebastian Blackwood cut an imposing figure in his evening clothes, his broad shoulders speaking of strength earned through war rather than leisure, his dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and his face would have been handsome by any measure save for the jagged scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale ridge of tissue that pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth and told the story of a cavalry saber that had nearly claimed his life at Waterloo. The assembled guests offered respectful nods and murmured greetings, the men stepping forward to clasp his hand in welcome, while the women curtsied with downcast eyes. And yet there remained that telltale aversion, that split-second hesitation before meeting his gaze, the flicker of pity that crossed even the most carefully composed faces, and Sebastian had long since learned to recognize these reactions with the bitter clarity of one who had lost his illusions about human nature on blood-soaked battlefields. He had been a hero once, celebrated for his valor and mourned when the war ended, and he withdrew to his estates. But heroism lost its luster when the hero returned marked by violence, and society's adulation had gradually transformed into this uncomfortable mixture of respect and relief when he kept to himself, managing his considerable holdings with cold efficiency and appearing at social functions only when obligation demanded. Sebastian moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries that meant nothing, and accepting condolences for his continued bachelorhood with a sardonic smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he was preparing to make his excuses and depart when his gaze swept across the ballroom and landed upon the figure in black, standing near the terrace doors, solitary and still as a monument to grief. He had heard of Lady Celeste Ashford, of course, the veiled widow who was not truly a widow at all, but something society lacked adequate language to describe, and in that moment when their eyes met across the sea of dancers and gossips and gilded superficiality, Sebastian felt a recognition that struck him with the force of a physical blow, for here was someone who understood what it meant to be seen and yet remain invisible, to exist in the world while being fundamentally apart from it, to carry wounds that society deemed too uncomfortable to acknowledge. She did not look away as others did, and though he could not see her expression beneath the veil, he sensed in her stillness a kinship that called to something long dormant in his chest, and before conscious thought could intervene, before caution could counsel him to maintain his careful distance, Sebastian found himself crossing the ballroom toward her with the same decisive determination that had once carried him into battle, and he did not stop until he stood before her, close enough to see the way her gloved hands tightened around each other, close enough to hear the soft catch of her breath, and he bowed with a formality that somehow felt like the beginning of something inevitable. "Lady Ashford," Sebastian said, his voice carrying the roughness of a man unaccustomed to social niceties, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" The request fell upon the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests who had stopped their own conversations to witness this unprecedented approach, for the scarred duke never danced, and the veiled lady never accepted, and yet here stood both of them in defiance of their established patterns, and Celeste felt her breath catch in her throat as she looked up at his extended hand, gloved and steady, and somehow less terrifying than any hand that had been offered to her in a decade. She placed her trembling fingers in his palm and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, acutely aware of every eye upon them, every whispered speculation about what this strange pairing might mean, and when Sebastian's arm came around her waist and they began to move in time with the music, Celeste thought she might shatter from the simple, overwhelming fact of human touch, of being held by another person after so many years of careful isolation. They moved in silence at first, both too conscious of their audience and their own awkwardness, but then Sebastian spoke quietly, his words meant only for her. "I find myself weary of their pity," he said, and there was a bitterness in his tone that she recognized intimately, weary of being treated as an object of tragedy rather than a man, weary of the carefully averted eyes and the assumption that I must be suffering endlessly from this mark upon my face. Celeste said nothing, but her hand tightened slightly on his shoulder in understanding, and he continued with a bluntness that might have shocked her had she not been so starved for honesty. "I propose a marriage of convenience, Lady Ashford, a union between two souls whom society has deemed damaged and therefore less than whole, a partnership that would provide us both with protection from their endless pity and speculation." The audacity of it, the sheer presumption, should have offended her, and yet Celeste found herself considering his words with a clarity that surprised her, for had she not just been thinking that her half-life of shadows was becoming unbearable, had she not wondered if there might be some alternative to this perpetual solitude? "You know nothing of me," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse in social settings, "nothing of what lies beneath this veil or why I choose to wear it." Sebastian's scarred mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "I know enough," he replied. "I know that you understand what it means to be marked by fate, to carry visible proof of suffering, to exist in a world that claims to accept you while never quite meeting your eyes. And I know that I would rather share my isolation with someone who comprehends it than continue alone in my fortress of stone and silence." They completed another turn around the floor, and Celeste felt the dangerous stirring of something she had thought long dead, a whisper of possibility, a fragment of hope that perhaps companionship might be found even in the ruins of their separate tragedies. "I would keep my veil," she said finally, testing the terms, needing to know if he would recoil from this condition. "I would require separate chambers, separate lives under the same roof, and protection without intimacy, an arrangement of mutual convenience, and nothing more." Sebastian nodded, his expression unreadable save for a flicker of something in his dark eyes that might have been relief or resignation, or perhaps both. "Those terms are acceptable," he said, and as the music drew to a close, as they stood together in the center of the ballroom with all of society watching, he raised her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture that sealed their strange bargain. And when the ball ended an hour later, they departed to separate carriages, both wondering what manner of prison or sanctuary they had just agreed to construct together. The wedding took place on a grey November morning in the private chapel of Sebastian's London residence, a small Gothic structure of stone and stained glass where light filtered through coloured panes to cast jewelled shadows across the cold floor. And there were no guests save the priest and 2 servants called in to serve as witnesses, no music save the whisper of wind against ancient windows, no celebration of union, but rather a solemn contract, signed in silence and sealed with words spoken in voices barely above a whisper. Celeste stood before the altar in a gown of deep charcoal silk that seemed more suited to mourning than matrimony, her black veil firmly in place, her hands trembling so violently within her gloves that she had to clasp them together to maintain composure, and she wondered with a sick flutter of panic what madness had possessed her to agree to this arrangement, to bind herself legally to a man she scarcely knew, to exchange one prison of isolation for another whose dimensions remained unknown and potentially more confining. Sebastian stood beside her in his formal attire, his expression carved from granite, his scarred face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. And when the moment came to lift her veil for the ceremonial kiss, he merely raised the fabric just enough to press his lips briefly to the black lace itself, a gesture that somehow felt more intimate than any touch of flesh to flesh. And then the brief ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced man and wife, bound together by law and convenience, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be marked by fate as unsuitable for ordinary happiness. The journey to Blackwood Hall took the better part of the day, their separate carriages travelling in tandem along roads that grew progressively narrower and more remote as they left London's sprawl behind and entered the wild moorlands of Yorkshire. And when at last the estate came into view as evening approached, Celeste felt her breath catch at the sight of it. For Blackwood Hall rose from the landscape like something conjured from a Gothic novel, all dark stone and imposing towers and narrow windows that reflected the dying light, like watchful eyes, surrounded by ancient oaks whose bare branches clawed at a sky heavy with the promise of winter storms. The housekeeper, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Daventry, who looked as though she had been carved from the same unyielding stone as the house itself, led Celeste through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and suits of armor that stood like silent sentinels, until they reached the Duchess's chambers in the East Wing, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold that might have been beautiful had they not felt so utterly cold and impersonal, untouched by human warmth for what must have been decades. Sebastian conducted a formal tour of the grounds as the last light faded, pointing out the gardens and the stables and the various outbuildings with the detached efficiency of a estate agent showing property to a prospective buyer, maintaining a careful physical distance of at least 3 feet between them at all times. And when he delivered her back to her chambers and explained that his own rooms were located in the West Wing, that they would take their meals separately unless she expressed a preference otherwise, that she was free to explore the house and grounds at her leisure, Celeste understood with crystalline clarity that she had indeed traded one form of loneliness for another, exchanging the familiar isolation of her previous life for this vast emptiness of stone and silence. Her first night in the unfamiliar house passed in sleepless restlessness, every creak and settling sound seeming magnified in the darkness, and once, near midnight, she heard footsteps pause outside her door and remain there for a long moment while she held her breath and waited. But then they moved on without the knock ever coming, and she lay awake wondering if Sebastian too was finding their arrangement more difficult than anticipated, or if she alone was discovering that convenience offered cold comfort, indeed, when one lay alone in the dark, with only regret and uncertainty for company. Weeks passed in careful silence, a choreography of avoidance performed daily within the vast corridors of Blackwood Hall, where Celeste and Sebastian moved like ghosts inhabiting the same haunted space, yet never quite occupying it together, their encounters limited to polite nods when they passed in hallways, or the occasional murmured greeting when they happened upon each other in the breakfast room, before one or the other would quickly excuse themselves and retreat to the safety of separation. Celeste found herself drawn to the library, that magnificent room of floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, whose musty scent spoke of centuries of accumulated knowledge, and she would spend hours there in a wing-backed chair near the eastern windows, losing herself in novels and poetry and philosophy, seeking in the written word the companionship she could not find in flesh and blood. And it was during these solitary afternoons that she began to feel the first stirrings of something that was not quite contentment, but perhaps its distant cousin, a sense that she might carve out an existence here among the books and shadows that would be bearable, if not fulfilling. What Celeste did not know was that Sebastian often observed her from the garden below, standing among the bare rose bushes and watching her silhouette framed in the library window. A dark figure bent over pages, and he would wonder what worlds she traveled in her reading, what thoughts moved behind that perpetual veil, what voice she might possess if ever she felt safe enough to speak freely in his presence. The pattern of their separate lives might have continued indefinitely, had nature not intervened in the form of a November rainstorm that arrived one evening with such sudden violence that Celeste, caught in the garden during her customary walk, was forced to seek shelter in the nearest entrance, which happened to lead to the drawing-room where Sebastian had retreated after dinner with his own book and a glass of brandy. They stood in awkward surprise at finding themselves thus trapped together, the rain lashing against the windows with such fury that venturing out again was unthinkable, and after a long moment of mutual hesitation, Sebastian gestured to the chair opposite his own and said with stiff formality, "You are welcome to wait here until the storm passes, if you wish." Celeste accepted with a small nod, settling into the offered chair and acutely aware of his presence mere feet away, aware of the sound of his breathing and the rustle of pages as he attempted to return to his reading, aware of the way the firelight cast his scarred profile in sharp relief, and how his long fingers held the book with surprising gentleness. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable but not entirely unbearable, until Sebastian, perhaps driven by the same restless need that made isolation sometimes more painful than connection, asked what she had been reading, and Celeste, startled by the direct question, answered that she had discovered a volume of Wordsworth's poetry in the library. This sparked a stilted but genuine discussion of literature, Sebastian revealing an unexpected depth of knowledge about the Romantic poets, Celeste gradually losing some of her nervousness as they debated the merits of Wordsworth versus Coleridge. And there came a moment when Sebastian opened his mouth as if to ask something more personal, perhaps about her life before Blackwood Hall or the reasons behind her veil. But then he seemed to think better of it and returned to safer literary ground. When they both reached simultaneously for the same book of Byron's verses that lay on the table between them, their gloved hands nearly touching before both pulled back as if burned, the air suddenly charged with an awareness that had not been present before, and they retreated shortly after to their separate wings, both lying awake long into the night and wondering if the chasm between them might perhaps be crossed, or if the safety of distance was worth the cost of continued loneliness. A pattern developed in the days that followed their rainstorm encounter, subtle at first but growing more pronounced with each passing evening, as both Celeste and Sebastian found themselves gravitating toward the library at the same twilight hour, drawn by something neither quite acknowledged, but both perhaps understood on some unspoken level, and they would settle into their customary chairs on opposite sides of the great room, with its towering shelves and Persian rugs worn soft by generations of footsteps, opening their respective books and reading in a silence that gradually transformed from awkward to companionable. At first they maintained this careful pretense of coincidental presence, each absorbed in private literary worlds, but then one evening Sebastian began reading aloud from a volume of Keats, his voice rich and resonant in the firelit quiet, the words flowing with unexpected beauty from lips more accustomed to terse commands and formal pleasantries. And Celeste felt something shift inside her chest as she listened to him speak of beauty and truth and the terrible brevity of mortal joy. She found herself closing her own book and simply listening, her hands folded in her lap beneath the black fabric of her veil, and when Sebastian finished the poem and glanced up to find her attention fixed upon him, he did not retreat into embarrassment, but instead asked if she had a favorite among the Romantics, and thus began their tentative exchange of literary opinions that grew bolder with each evening's conversation. Celeste discovered that she could speak more freely when discussing poetry and philosophy than she ever could about personal matters, and Sebastian seemed to understand this instinctively, allowing their conversations to remain in the safer realm of ideas, while gradually revealing fragments of himself through the passages he chose to read and the observations he offered. It was during a discussion of Wordsworth's meditation on memory and loss that Celeste made a wry comment about the poet's perhaps excessive optimism regarding nature's healing powers, and Sebastian laughed, a genuine sound of surprised delight that seemed to startle them both. And then Celeste found herself laughing too, a light bubbling sound that she had not heard from her own throat in so many years that it seemed to belong to some other woman, some earlier version of herself who had existed before fire and pain and isolation had taught her that joy was a luxury afforded only to the unmarked. Sebastian's expression in that moment was one of such visible wonder and pleasure that Celeste felt heat rise in her cheeks beneath her veil, and she realized, with a flutter of something dangerously close to anticipation, that she had begun to look forward to these evening hours in the library, that she found herself listening throughout the day for the sound of his footsteps in distant corridors, and wondering what book he might choose to read that night, what thoughts he might share, what small glimpses into his guarded interior he might inadvertently reveal. For his part, Sebastian discovered that the library felt strangely empty on the rare evenings when estate business kept him away past their usual hour, that he would find himself rushing through correspondence and accounts in order to reach that firelit room where Celeste waited with her books and her surprising insights, and that musical laugh that had become more precious to him than he dared examine too closely, and though they still maintained careful physical distance, never sitting closer than the width of the oriental carpet between them, never allowing even accidental contact, both began to sense that the chasm separating them was perhaps not quite as unbridgeable as they had once believed, that loneliness shared in companionable silence might be the first tentative step towards something neither yet had the courage to name. The rose garden at Blackwood Hall had become Celeste's private sanctuary in the weeks since her marriage, a place where she could walk among the thorny bushes and late-blooming flowers without encountering servants or the penetrating gaze of her husband, and it was there on a crisp December morning that she found herself attempting to prune back the wild growth that threatened to overtake the stone pathways, her gloved hands working carefully among the branches despite her limited experience with such practical tasks. She had been absorbed in her work for perhaps an hour when her veil, that constant companion of black silk, caught upon a particularly vicious thorn, and as she turned her head the fabric pulled taut and would not come free no matter how gently she tugged at it, the thorns seeming to grip the delicate material with malicious intent, and in her struggle to liberate herself without tearing the veil, she felt the sharp prick of thorns against her fingers, even through the thin leather of her gloves. A soft sound of frustration escaped her lips as a drop of blood bloomed on the pale glove, covering her right hand, and she was contemplating whether she would need to sacrifice the veil to the rose's custody when Sebastian's voice came from behind her, asking if she required assistance, his sudden appearance startling her into stillness. He must have been walking the grounds and observed her predicament, and now he approached with careful steps, as though afraid of frightening a wounded bird, and when Celeste nodded her acceptance of his help, he moved closer than they had yet been outside the formal structure of a dance, so close that she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to him, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold morning air. Sebastian's hands were remarkably gentle as he worked to untangle the veil from the thorns, his scarred fingers moving with practiced precision among the sharp points, and Celeste found her breath catching in her throat at his proximity, at the concentration evident in his expression as he freed first one strand of silk and then another, his face mere inches from her own veiled one as he completed the delicate task. When the veil finally came free, he did not immediately step away, but instead noticed the blood on her glove, and his expression shifted to one of concern as he asked if she was hurt, reaching for her hand with a tentative touch that sent an unexpected warmth through her entire arm. Celeste assured him it was merely a scratch, nothing of consequence, but Sebastian surprised her by asking if she enjoyed working with the roses, and when she confessed that she found peace in the garden but lacked proper knowledge of their care, he offered to show her the techniques he had learned from his own mother, who had maintained these very roses before her death. Thus began their first shared activity beyond literary conversation, Sebastian fetching pruning shears and gloves from the garden shed while Celeste watched with growing wonder, and soon they were working side by side among the bushes, Sebastian demonstrating how to cut at an angle to encourage new growth, how to identify which canes should be removed and which preserved, his hands moving over the plants with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his martial bearing and war-hardened exterior. Celeste observed the contrast between the man who commanded estates and had led soldiers into battle, and this same man who handled delicate rose blooms as though they were precious beyond measure, who spoke of the plants with genuine affection and knowledge, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of their shared work, asking questions about different varieties and listening to his patient explanations. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same branch, and neither pulled away immediately, the accidental contact lingering for a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary before they continued their work with heightened awareness of each other's presence, and Celeste felt something shift inside her chest, some small barrier beginning to crack beneath the gentle pressure of Sebastian's steady kindness, and the surprising intimacy of working together in the winter garden, where thorns drew blood, but roses promised the eventual return of beauty. As autumn deepened into early winter, and the first frost painted the windows of Blackwood Hall with crystalline patterns, Celeste had settled into an uneasy peace with her new life, finding comfort in the daily rhythms of shared library hours and occasional garden work with Sebastian. But on a bitter December night, when wind howled around the manor's ancient stones, she was awakened from fitful sleep by sounds that sent ice through her veins, screams, raw and agonized, coming from the distant west wing, where Sebastian kept his chambers. She lay frozen in her bed for several heartbeats, her mind racing between conflicting impulses, respect for his privacy and the formal distance they still maintained despite their growing closeness, or the compassionate urge to offer comfort to someone clearly suffering in the grip of nightmare terrors she understood all too well from her own haunted nights. Compassion won, and Celeste rose from her bed, pulling a wrapper over her nightgown and moving through the darkened corridors with only a single candle to light her way, her heart pounding as another cry echoed through the empty halls, and she found herself standing before Sebastian's door for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Hall, her hand trembling as she knocked softly and received no response, save another tormented shout. She pushed the door open to find Sebastian thrashing in his massive four-poster bed, his scarred face contorted in anguish, sheets twisted around his body as he fought invisible enemies and called out warnings to soldiers long dead. And Celeste felt her own breath catch at the sight of this powerful man reduced to such vulnerable suffering, trapped in memories of war and death, and the moment that had marked his face forever. She approached the bed slowly, speaking his name in a soft but clear voice, repeating it like an anchor to draw him back from whatever battlefield he relived in his sleeping mind. And when his eyes finally flew open, they were wild and unfocused, shame flooding his features as consciousness returned, and he realized she had witnessed him in this state of weakness he had clearly worked so hard to conceal. Sebastian tried to apologize, to order her from the room with gruff embarrassment, but Celeste moved to the washstand and poured water into a glass with steady hands, bringing it to him and settling herself in the chair by the window when he tried to wave her away, and she spoke the words that seemed to flow from some deep well of shared understanding. "I know what it is to be trapped in memories that refuse to release their hold, Sebastian. You need not bear this alone." Something shifted in his expression then, the rigid armor of masculine pride cracking just enough to allow truth to emerge, and he admitted in a voice rough with exhaustion and shame that he relived the battle most nights, saw again the explosion that had torn through his regiment and marked his face, heard the screams of men he could not save, and felt the weight of command that had sent young soldiers to their deaths. Celeste listened without judgment or platitudes, understanding that sometimes the greatest comfort was simply presence, the knowledge that another soul bore witness to your pain and did not turn away, and she remained in that chair as the night slowly gave way to dawn, a silent guardian watching over Sebastian as he finally fell into quieter sleep. And when morning light crept through the curtains and he woke to find her still there, the awkward acknowledgement that passed between them carried the weight of something fundamental that had shifted in the architecture of their careful arrangement, a recognition that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there could be no returning to the formal distance of before. The morning after Celeste had kept vigil through Sebastian's nightmares brought an unexpected shift in the careful choreography of their separate lives. For when she descended to breakfast expecting the usual solitary meal, she found a note in Sebastian's precise handwriting, requesting that she join him for dinner that evening in the small dining room rather than the formal hall where they had taken their wedding breakfast in strained silence, and though her immediate reaction was nervousness at the thought of dining together, of attempting to eat while maintaining the veil that had become both shield and prison, she found herself penning an acceptance before doubt could override. Her tentative trust in this man who had shown her nothing but patience and unexpected gentleness. Sebastian's solution to the practical difficulty of her veiled state revealed a thoughtfulness that made her throat tighten with emotion she had not expected to feel again. For when she entered the small dining room that evening, she found the space transformed by dimmed lamps and strategically placed candles that created pools of soft shadow. It's enough light to see one's plate and companion, but dark enough that her careful lifting of the veil to take small bites would not fully expose the scars she still could not bear to reveal, and the symbolism of this gesture was not lost on either of them, as Sebastian rose to seat her with a formality that somehow felt more intimate than casual familiarity would have been. Their conversation that first evening began with the safe topics they had explored in the library books recently read. Observations about the changing season, mundane estate matters, but as the wine was poured and courses came and went, Sebastian began to speak of his childhood before war had claimed him, describing a boy who had loved horses and literature in equal measure, who had imagined a life of scholarly pursuits rather than military service, and Celeste found herself responding with fragments of her own past. The sister she had lost in the fire that had marked her forever, Margaret, who had been just 16 and full of dreams of her first London season. The revelation came quietly, almost without Celeste realizing she was speaking it aloud, that her scars were not merely physical, but carved deep into her spirit by the knowledge that she had survived while Margaret had perished, that she had been sleeping safely in the East Wing when fire consumed the West, and the guilt of that survival had weighed upon her for a decade like a stone she could neither carry nor set down. Sebastian's response was not the platitude she had learned to expect from the few who had dared speak of her tragedy, but rather a recognition born of his own parallel wounds, as his own guilt over the soldiers who had fallen while he lived, young men whose names he still recited in the dark hours when sleep would not come, and in that moment of shared confession, they recognized in each other not merely kindred spirits marked by physical scars, but souls bound by the complex weight of surviving when others had not. The agreement to make these dinners their ritual came without formal discussion, simply an understanding that settled between them like the winter darkness beyond the windows, and as Celeste retired to her chambers that night, she carried with her the warmth of knowing that loneliness, at least, was a burden she might no longer bear alone. The obligation to attend the village Christmas festival arrived with the December cold, a duty that came with Sebastian's title and their position as Duke and Duchess of the surrounding estates, and when Sebastian mentioned it during one of their intimate dinners, Celeste felt terror grip her heart with familiar icy fingers. For attending structured balls where she could stand at the periphery was one thing, but mixing among villagers in daylight, subjected to close scrutiny and the curious stares of children who had never learned to hide their reactions, seemed a trial beyond her capacity to endure. Sebastian, who had grown adept at reading the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands trembled when fear overtook her, immediately offered to send their regrets, to invent some excuse that would spare her this ordeal, but Celeste found within herself a stubborn pride she had not known still existed, a refusal to disappoint the villagers who depended upon Blackwood Hall and who had shown nothing but respectful courtesy during her few ventures into the village shops, always with her veil firmly in place. The festival itself was a scene of rustic charm that might have delighted her in another life, with children laughing as they chased one another through the snow-dusted square, carolers gathered around a bonfire singing ancient hymns, and stalls offering mulled wine and roasted chestnuts that filled the air with warmth and spice. But Celeste felt each curious glance like a physical touch, saw the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, heard the whispers that followed in her wake, though most tried to be discreet about their fascination with the veiled phantom who had married their duke. She was maintaining her composure through sheer force of will, standing beside Sebastian as he spoke with the village elder about repairs needed to the church roof, when she overheard two women behind a nearby stall speaking in voices they clearly believed were too low to carry. One saying to the other that it was a shame the Duke had bound himself to such a creature, that whatever lay beneath that veil must be monstrous indeed for a woman to hide for so many years. And Celeste felt something crack inside her chest. The fragile confidence she had been building through weeks of Sebastian's patient kindness shattering like ice beneath a boot. She turned to flee, caring nothing for propriety or duty, needing only to escape the suffocating weight of judgment and disgust. But Sebastian's hand caught hers before she had taken 3 steps, his grip firm and warm through her glove, and when she looked up at him through the blur of tears, she saw fury in his scarred face, a protective rage that transformed him into something fierce and formidable as he turned to face the assembled villagers with the full authority of his rank and his considerable presence. His voice carried across the suddenly silent square as he declared that any person who showed disrespect to his Duchess showed disrespect to him personally, that Lady Celeste was a woman of more courage and grace than most would ever possess, and that he would not tolerate cruelty or mockery toward her in his village or on his lands. And the two women who had spoken so carelessly found themselves the focus of the Duke's cold stare until they stammered apologies and retreated in shame, while the rest of the villagers watched with expressions ranging from surprise to grudging respect. The walk home through falling snow became something Celeste would remember forever, Sebastian still holding her hand as they moved through the winter landscape, and she was overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sensation of being defended, protected, valued enough that someone would stand against the world's cruelty on her behalf. Their return to Blackwood Hall carried the strange quality of a dream, both of them shaken by the public confrontation in ways that left them silent during the carriage ride home, and when they finally stepped into the entrance hall with snow melting from their coats. Sebastian's anger at society's cruelty was still evident in the tension of his jaw and the way his scarred hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as though he wished to strike out at all the ignorance and casual cruelty that had wounded his wife. Celeste stood trembling in the soft lamplight, her composure finally crumbling now that they were away from watching eyes, and the tears she had held back through sheer force of will began to fall in silent streams beneath her veil, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions too long contained, and Sebastian made an awkward, uncertain movement toward her before reaching into his coat to offer his handkerchief with the careful formality of a man unpracticed in comforting others. The words broke from her then, raw and terrible in their self-loathing, as she said that he should not have bound himself to a monster, that he had sacrificed his dignity and his future for a marriage of convenience to a woman who could not even show her face in public without inspiring disgust, and she could hear the bitterness in her own voice, the decade of accumulated shame and isolation pouring out in the privacy of their home, where she no longer had the strength to pretend that the world's judgment did not cut her to the bone. Sebastian's response was fierce and immediate, his voice rough with an intensity that startled her as he declared that if she was a monster, then so was he, that his scars marked him just as surely as hers marked her, and that anyone who could not see past the surface to the strength and grace beneath deserved nothing but contempt, and there was something in his passion that silenced her protests and made her truly look at him for perhaps the first time since they had wed. He spoke then of what he saw when he looked at her, not the hidden face beneath the veil, but the woman who had survived fire and loss, who had endured a decade of isolation with dignity, who had shown him kindness in his nightmares and companionship in his loneliness, and he confessed with halting honesty that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something far more profound to him, something he had not anticipated and did not fully understand, but could no longer deny. Celeste stood frozen in disbelief as Sebastian's words washed over her, unable to comprehend how anyone could find her anything but hideous, how this man, who could have had his choice of beautiful, unmarred women, had somehow come to value her, and when he met her eyes with that unflinching directness that characterized all his dealings with her, she saw truth there that terrified her more than any cruelty ever had. His final admission came quietly, almost tenderly, as he said that he had fallen in love with her voice during their library evenings, with her mind during their dinner conversations, with her spirit as he watched her face each day with courage most would never possess, and that the woman beneath the veil mattered far less to him than the woman he had come to know through weeks of patient revelation. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and terror, charged with the weight of confessions that could not be taken back, and Celeste felt herself suspended between the desire to believe and the certainty born of long experience that such acceptance could not be real, could not last. It would shatter the moment he truly saw what she had hidden for so long, and so she did what she had always done. When emotions threatened to overwhelm her defenses, she retreated to her chambers with a whispered apology, leaving Sebastian standing alone in the entrance hall while she fled to the safety of solitude to wrestle with the impossible hope his words had planted in her wounded heart. Celeste lay sleepless in her chambers through the long winter night, replaying Sebastian's confession with obsessive precision, hearing again and again the rough tenderness in his voice when he said he had fallen in love with her voice, her mind, her spirit, and she found herself caught in an internal war between desire and fear that left her trembling beneath her coverlets as the hours crept toward dawn. The possibility that someone might truly see past her ruined face to the woman beneath seemed too fragile a hope to trust, too dangerous a dream to entertain, for she had learned through brutal experience what happened when she allowed herself to believe in love's endurance, and the memory of that lesson rose now, with vivid clarity, to torment her in the darkness. She had been engaged once, before the fire, to a young man who had sworn eternal devotion and written poetry, comparing her beauty to spring flowers and morning light, and she could still remember with perfect, agonizing detail the moment he had first seen her burns after the physicians had finally removed the bandages, could still see the horror that had flooded his handsome face and replaced his practiced declarations of love with stuttered excuses and hasty retreat, and within a week he had broken their engagement through a letter delivered by servant because he lacked even the courage to face her directly. That abandonment had taught her the truth she had carried for 10 years like a stone around her neck, the certainty that whatever kindness or attraction she might inspire would shatter the moment the veil came down, that she was fundamentally unlovable in her scarred state, that the best she could hope for was the polite tolerance of those who pitied her suffering but could never truly accept her altered appearance. But Sebastian's words tonight had planted a seed of revolutionary doubt in that long-held conviction, for he had his own scars and his own experience of society's cruelty, and perhaps that shared understanding gave him a different perspective, a capacity to see past surfaces that her previous fiancé had lacked entirely. She thought of Sebastian's consistent kindness over the weeks of their marriage, the way he had never pressed her to reveal herself, never demanded more than she could offer, yet had gradually built a foundation of trust through patience and genuine companionship, and she wondered if his confession might be not the pretty lie she expected, but rather the simple truth of a man who had come to know her in ways that went deeper than physical appearance. As winter's first light began to filter through her curtains, painting the familiar room in shades of grey and pale gold, Celeste made a decision that terrified her more than any she had faced since agreeing to this marriage. For she understood that she stood at a crossroads where she could either retreat further into the safety of isolation or step forward into the terrifying vulnerability of trust. And she chose, with trembling resolve, born of Sebastian's fierce defense at the village festival and his raw honesty in the entrance hall, to believe that perhaps this scarred duke might truly mean what he said. Her hands shook as she reached for the clasp of her veil in the morning light, feeling the familiar weight of black fabric that had been both protection and prison for a decade, and she understood with crystalline clarity that removing it for Sebastian would require more courage than she had ever needed to face society's stares. For this time, her heart was engaged in ways it had not been since before the fire, and the possibility of rejection now carried the power to wound her more deeply than any casual cruelty from strangers ever could. Celeste's journey through Blackwood Hall to Sebastian's study carried the quality of a condemned prisoner's final walk, each step requiring conscious effort as her resolve warred with the terror that threatened to send her fleeing back to the safety of her chambers. But she forced herself forward, through corridors now familiar yet suddenly strange, the veil still in place though her hands had already made the decision her heart feared, and when she reached the heavy oak door of his study, she paused with her hand raised to knock, wondering if this was madness, If she was about to shatter the fragile peace they had built by revealing the truth he claimed not to care about, but surely would recoil from once confronted with its reality. She knocked, heard his deep voice bid her enter, and found him at his desk reviewing estate papers with the careful attention he brought to all his responsibilities, and when he looked up, his expression shifted immediately from concentration to surprise and then concern at her unusual morning visit, for they had established patterns over these months of marriage, and her appearance in his private domain at this hour broke every unspoken rule of their careful cohabitation. Sebastian rose from his desk with the instinctive courtesy that characterized all his dealings with her, his scarred face showing both curiosity and worry as he asked if something was wrong, if she needed his assistance with some matter, and Celeste found her voice caught in her throat as she stood before him, understanding that she was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no retreat, and she managed to request in a voice that trembled, despite her efforts at control, that he stand facing her, that he give her this moment without questions, and she saw in his dark eyes the instant of recognition as he understood what she intended, and went utterly still, with a stillness that spoke of hope and fear in equal measure. The moment suspended itself in time as Celeste's hands rose to the clasp of her veil, with fingers that shook so violently she could barely manage the simple mechanism, and she was aware of Sebastian's careful immobility, of the way he seemed to have stopped breathing as he waited for her to complete this action she had avoided for a decade, and the veil came free with a whisper of fabric that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet study, falling away to pool at her feet like shed armor, exposing for the first time since their wedding the face she had hidden from him and from the world. The burn scars ran along the left side of her face from temple to jaw and down her neck, puckered tissue that had healed in twisted patterns that disrupted the symmetry of her features and marked her indelibly with the fire's legacy, and Celeste kept her eyes squeezed shut because she could not bear to watch Sebastian's reaction, could not endure seeing the moment when wonder turned to horror and tenderness transformed into polite distance. But she heard his sharp intake of breath and felt immediate crushing regret, the certainty that she had destroyed whatever fragile connection they had built by forcing him to confront the reality of her disfigurement. Sebastian's movement was so gentle, she barely registered it until she felt his presence close before her, felt the warmth of him near enough to touch, and his voice when he spoke was rough with emotion as he said her name, and then added with infinite tenderness the words that would echo in her heart for the rest of her days, asking her to open her eyes, please, and to look at him and see what he saw, and though terror screamed at her to keep her eyes closed and preserve for one moment more the illusion that he might accept her, she found the courage to obey and opened her eyes to meet his gaze, bracing herself for the revulsion she was certain would be written there. Celeste's tears spilled over as she opened her eyes to meet Sebastian's gaze, bracing herself for the revulsion she had witnessed so many times in her nightmares. But what she found in his dark eyes was not horror or pity or polite distance, but rather a wonder so profound and a tenderness so complete that it stole her breath more effectively than any cruelty ever could, and she watched in disbelieving stillness as his scarred hand rose slowly to her face, giving her every opportunity to pull away, before his fingers made contact with the puckered tissue of her burns and traced the twisted paths with infinite gentleness, as though he were touching something precious and fragile rather than the disfigurement that had haunted her for a decade. Sebastian's voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion as he asked her if she knew what he saw when he looked at her unveiled face, and before she could respond with the litany of ugliness she had recited to herself for years, he told her that he saw courage written in every mark the fire had left, saw survival and strength, and a beauty that had been earned through unimaginable pain rather than merely inherited through chance of birth, and his words landed on her wounded heart like balm on ancient injuries, as he confessed that he had never expected to feel this way about anyone, and had resigned himself to a life of emotional isolation until she had appeared at that charity ball, wrapped in black fabric and loneliness. He told her that her willingness to show him this vulnerability, to trust him with the truth she had hidden from the world, humbled him in ways he could barely articulate, for he understood the courage it required to lower defenses that had been a decade in the building, and Celeste felt her disbelief beginning to give way to tremulous hope as she searched his face for any sign of the revulsion she still half expected to discover, lurking beneath his tender words. Sebastian's thumb brushed away her tears with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had wielded weapons in war, and after a moment of charged silence, he asked in a voice barely above a whisper if he might kiss her, and the question itself was a gift, because it gave her choice and agency, in a moment when she felt utterly exposed and vulnerable, and she managed to whisper her permission through tears that now flowed from wonder rather than fear. The first kiss was gentle and reverent, and accepting in ways that rewrote every certainty Celeste had carried about her own unlovability, for Sebastian kissed her scarred cheek and her marked temple, and finally her trembling lips with a tenderness that spoke of devotion rather than duty, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her, as walls that had been carefully constructed over years of isolation began to crumble, and when she realized that Sebastian was crying too, his own tears mingling with hers as they held each other in the quiet study, she understood that this moment marked not just an unveiling of her face, but a revelation of hearts that had both been hiding in different ways, and the isolation that had defined them both was finally, blessedly, coming to an end. In the days that followed the unveiling, Celeste moved through Blackwood Hall without her veil for the first time since becoming the Duchess, and the experience carried a strange quality of lightness mixed with lingering fear, as though she had shed not merely fabric, but the weight of years spent in hiding. Yet old habits died slowly, and she found herself reaching for the veil each morning before remembering with a jolt of mingled terror and exhilaration that she need not hide any longer, at least not within these walls, where Sebastian's acceptance had rewritten every certainty she had carried about her own monstrosity. Sebastian's constant reassurance came not through grand declarations, but through small gestures that accumulated into proof of his devotion. The way his hand found hers as they walked the corridors, the tender kiss he pressed to her scarred temple each morning at breakfast, the careful attention he paid to her comfort as she navigated this new exposure, never pushing but always present, and Celeste felt herself slowly unfurling like a flower that had been too long denied sunlight. The servants' initial shock at seeing their mistress's unveiled face gave way to acceptance more quickly than Celeste had dared hope, and when the housekeeper commented one afternoon that it was lovely to finally see the Duchess's smile properly, Celeste had felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple kindness of the observation, understanding that she had been seen and not found wanting. The exploration of physical intimacy between them deepened with each passing day, as Celeste grew more comfortable with Sebastian's touch and his unwavering desire for her, and they spent long evenings in the library, where conversations about literature had transformed into discussions of their future, with Sebastian suggesting they might travel together once she felt ready, might see the wider world beyond the careful boundaries she had constructed. And though Celeste's fear of public scrutiny warred with her growing desire for freedom, she found courage in Sebastian's patience and his willingness to wait until she was truly ready to face society on her own terms. Their late-night conversations revealed dreams neither had dared speak aloud during their months of careful distance, hopes for a life that extended beyond mere cohabitation into genuine partnership, and Celeste discovered that vulnerability, rather than destroying her, as she had always feared, was instead forging connections stronger than any armor she had worn. The night came when she found herself standing outside Sebastian's chambers as the house settled into darkness, her heart pounding with a mixture of desire and nervousness, and when she knocked softly and entered at his surprised invitation, she asked with trembling voice if he might stay with her, if they might finally bridge the physical distance they had maintained even after emotional walls had fallen, and Sebastian's response carried such tenderness and careful concern for her comfort that Celeste felt the last of her reservations dissolve like morning mist before sun. Their union that night was gentle and healing, and transformative in ways that transcended the physical act itself, for Sebastian touched her scarred skin with reverence rather than revulsion, mapping the landscape of her burns with careful fingers, and whispered assurances that she was beautiful and desired and wholly accepted. And Celeste discovered that intimacy could be redemptive rather than shameful, that her body, despite its marks, could be a source of pleasure rather than merely pain. And as she lay afterwards in Sebastian's arms, listening to his steady heartbeat, she understood that they had both been transformed by their willingness to risk vulnerability, that the arrangement born of isolation and mutual protection had blossomed into something neither had dared imagine possible. As spring arrived with its promise of renewal and the gardens of Blackwood Hall burst into fragrant bloom, a letter arrived that carried the weight of a past Celeste had long since resigned herself to leaving behind, for the elegant script on the envelope belonged to her mother, Lady Margaret Ashford, and the very sight of it caused Celeste's hands to tremble as she broke the seal in the privacy of the morning room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and illuminated the careful words requesting reconciliation and extending an invitation to visit the family estate she had not seen since the terrible fire that had claimed her younger sister's life and left Celeste herself permanently marked. The emotions that flooded through her were complex and contradictory, a tangled mass of anger at the family who had retreated from her in the aftermath of tragedy. Longing for the connection she had once known before, Burns had redefined every relationship, and fear that facing them again would resurrect pain she had worked so hard to transcend. And when Sebastian found her still holding the letter an hour later with tears tracking silently down her scarred cheeks, he simply gathered her into his arms and held her, while she struggled to articulate the storm of feelings the simple invitation had unleashed. Sebastian's support came without pressure or presumption, as he told her the decision was entirely hers to make, that he would support whatever choice brought her peace, but if she chose to face her family, he would be beside her every step of the journey. And Celeste found courage in his steady presence as she penned a response accepting the invitation with the condition that Sebastian would accompany her, unable to imagine confronting the ghosts of her past without the man who had taught her that love could exist beyond the surface. The journey to her childhood home in Hampshire was filled with memories that flooded back with each familiar landmark they passed, the grand estate emerging from behind ancient oaks, exactly as she remembered it, yet somehow diminished by time and her own growth. And as their carriage rolled up the sweeping drive, Celeste felt Sebastian's hand tighten around hers in silent solidarity, while her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a decade's worth of unspoken grievances and unhealed wounds. Her mother waited on the front steps in a pose of careful composure that shattered the moment she saw Celeste's unveiled face, and the sharp intake of breath and visible shock that crossed Lady Margaret's refined features confirmed every fear Celeste had harbored about this reunion. But she lifted her chin and descended from the carriage with the grace Sebastian had helped her reclaim, refusing to shrink from her mother's stare, even as old instincts screamed at her to hide. The initial hours were marked by awkward silences and painfully formal pleasantries as they took tea in the drawing room where Celeste had once played as a child, the very room where she and her sister had laughed and conspired and dreamed of futures that the fire had stolen. And when her mother finally gathered the courage to ask directly about the years since Celeste had left, the question opened a floodgate that Celeste had not realized she had been holding back, and her confrontation about their abandonment in her darkest hour emerged not as a scream but as a quiet, devastating recitation of facts that left her mother pale and trembling. And when Lady Margaret's tears finally came, they carried with them an admission of cowardice and regret that had evidently haunted her for a decade, though Celeste found it difficult in that moment to offer the immediate forgiveness her mother's stricken face seemed to plead for, needing instead to let the truth of their mutual wounding settle between them like dust after a collapse. The difficult conversations with her family unfolded over several days that felt simultaneously endless and far too brief, each discussion peeling back another layer of the grief and misunderstanding that had calcified between them over a decade of separation. And as Celeste sat in the morning room with her mother on the second day of their visit, she began to understand through Lady Margaret's halting explanations that her mother's own fear and inability to cope with the tragedy of losing one daughter while seeing another permanently altered had created a paralysis that masqueraded as coldness, a retreat born not of rejection but of overwhelming helplessness in the face of such profound loss. The recognition that everyone had been wounded by the fire in different ways came slowly to Celeste as she listened to her father's halting apology delivered in his study with Sebastian, standing quietly supportive in the corner, Lord Ashford admitting with tears in his weathered eyes that he had failed her utterly when she needed him most, that his own inability to look at her scarred face without seeing the flames that had consumed his younger daughter had driven him to the cowardice of distance, and though his confession could not erase the years of abandonment, it opened a door to understanding that Celeste had thought permanently sealed. Her younger brother, Edmund, who had been merely a boy of 12 when the fire occurred and was now a young man of 22, approached her with awe rather than pity, as he confessed that he had spent years wondering about the sister who had vanished from his life. And when he told her that her courage to face the world with her scars visible inspired him far more than any tale of unblemished heroism ever could, Celeste felt something crack open in her chest, a realization that her survival itself carried meaning beyond her own pain. The healing power of honesty and accountability revealed itself through these painful exchanges, as each family member in turn acknowledged their failures and their regrets, not seeking absolution but offering truth, and Celeste discovered that forgiveness, when it finally came, freed her far more than it freed them, releasing her from the bitterness she had carried like a stone in her heart. Sebastian's steady presence throughout every difficult conversation became her anchor, as he sat beside her during meals grown less awkward with each passing day, walked with her through the gardens where she and her lost sister had once played, and offered silent support when emotions threatened to overwhelm her careful composure, never intruding but always present, and her family's growing respect for the Duke, who so obviously cherished their daughter, was evident in the way her father sought Sebastian's opinion on estate matters, and her mother watched them together with tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. On their final evening before departure, Lady Margaret took Celeste's scarred hands in her own and whispered a private gratitude to Sebastian for giving her daughter the happiness she had feared Celeste would never know. And though the relationships remained tender and tentative as they made their farewells, Celeste understood that they were mending rather than broken beyond repair, that the journey toward peace required only the courage to begin walking it. And as their carriage rolled away from the estate with Sebastian's arm around her shoulders, she reflected that confronting the past had somehow freed her future in ways she had not anticipated, that forgiveness had proven to be not a gift she gave to those who had wounded her, but rather a gift she gave to herself. That summer brought with it a decision that would have seemed impossible mere months before, for Celeste and Sebastian determined together that they would host a grand ball at Blackwood Hall, and though the prospect terrified Celeste in ways she could scarcely articulate even to her husband, she felt a fierce determination rising within her to face society on her own terms, rather than continuing to exist on its periphery like some half-acknowledged shadow. Her involvement in every detail of the preparations became her way of claiming her role as Duchess in truth rather than merely in name, from selecting the musicians who would play to approving the floral arrangements that would transform the ballroom into a garden of light and color, and Sebastian watched with quiet pride as she moved through these tasks with growing confidence, no longer shrinking from the servants' gazes or hiding in the corners of her own home. The night of the ball arrived with the warmth of summer evening settling over the estate like a blessing, and when Celeste descended the grand staircase in an elegant gown of deep sapphire silk, with her scarred face completely bare to the world, she felt Sebastian's sharp intake of breath and saw the love and admiration blazing in his eyes, and that look steadied her more than any amount of practiced composure ever could. The guests arrived in their carriages as twilight deepened into night, the cream of local society along with several prominent families from London, and Celeste stood beside Sebastian in the receiving line, feeling every stare like a physical touch, hearing the whispers that rippled through the crowd as each new arrival caught sight of the Duchess's unveiled face, but she kept her chin high and her hand steady in Sebastian's as they welcomed each guest with the grace befitting their stations. The internal strength she drew upon came not merely from Sebastian's love, though that formed the bedrock of her courage, but from the entire journey she had undertaken since that first fateful ball where a scarred duke had seen past her veil to the woman beneath, and she understood now that she had earned the right to stand here not in spite of her scars, but because of everything they represented about survival and resilience, and the choice to live rather than merely exist. When Sebastian led her onto the floor for the opening waltz, the entire ballroom fell silent in a way that might have paralyzed her with fear a year ago. But now she simply gazed into her husband's scarred face and let the music carry them. Their movements together, a public declaration of their partnership, and their defiance of society's shallow judgments. Society's gradual shift from shock to something approaching admiration became evident as the evening progressed, and guests observed the Duke and Duchess's obvious devotion to one another, The way Sebastian's hand never strayed far from Celeste's, the manner in which they seemed to communicate in glances and small gestures that spoke of deep intimacy, and several of the younger women present approached Celeste throughout the night to tell her in hushed, awed voices that her courage inspired them in ways they struggled to articulate. And when the last guest departed in the early hours of morning, and Sebastian swept Celeste into his arms in the emptied ballroom, she understood that the evening's success represented acceptance earned through authenticity rather than granted through pity, and that made all the difference in the world. 2 years had passed since their wedding day when Celeste had stood veiled and trembling before an altar, never imagining that the cold arrangement she was entering would transform into something so profound and all-encompassing that it would reshape not merely her daily existence, but the very essence of who she understood herself to be. And in those 2 years, she and Sebastian had forged a partnership in estate management that went far beyond the formal duties expected of a duke and duchess, working together in his study over ledgers and correspondence, consulting one another on decisions both minor and momentous, their scarred hands sometimes brushing across the desk as they reached for the same document, in a casual intimacy that still made Celeste's heart quicken with wonder at how far they had traveled from those early days of careful distance. Celeste had discovered within herself a calling she had never anticipated, beginning to work with burn survivors in the surrounding counties, offering support and hope born from her own hard-won journey from hiding to living. And when these women and children came to Blackwood Hall to meet with her, some still fresh from their injuries and others bearing scars decades old, she would speak to them with a gentle authority about the truth that scars need not define a life, that survival itself was a form of courage, and watching their faces shift from despair toward possibility reminded her of Sebastian's patient faith in her when she had possessed none in herself. Sebastian had expanded the veteran services on the estate in parallel to Celeste's work, creating a sanctuary for soldiers bearing wounds both visible and invisible, and together they had built something larger than themselves, a shared mission rooted in the understanding that healing often required not merely time, but the presence of others who truly comprehended the weight of carrying trauma forward into an unforgiving world. The announcement of Celeste's pregnancy came on an autumn morning that echoed the season of their first meeting, and though joy flooded through her at the knowledge that she carried Sebastian's child, she found herself wrestling with fears about passing her trauma to an innocent soul, about whether a woman so marked by suffering could possibly raise a child free from the shadows that had once consumed her own existence. Sebastian's reassurance came not through empty platitudes, but through his characteristic directness as he took her scarred face between his hands and promised that they would teach their child strength rather than shame, courage rather than concealment, and that their scars would become lessons in survival rather than sources of sorrow. And in his steady gaze, Celeste found the faith to believe him. The preparation of the nursery became a ritual of hope as they chose soft fabrics and painted walls in warm colors, dreaming aloud about the future they would give this child and the world they would help create, where scars of any kind need not condemn a person to isolation. And Celeste would often stand in that sun-filled room with her hand on her growing belly, reflecting on the extraordinary transformation from the hollow arrangement they had begun with to the deep love that now anchored every aspect of their shared life. The birth came with the first snow of winter, and when Celeste held her daughter for the first time and looked into eyes that were unmistakably Sebastian's, and she saw, reflected there not merely her husband's features, but also a fierce spirit that spoke of courage, inherited and earned. And when Sebastian wept openly at the sight of his wife and child, Celeste understood that they had created between them something more miraculous than either had imagined possible on that long-ago night when a scarred duke had approached a veiled woman across a crowded ballroom. They named her Hope for the gift they had found in each other when both had believed themselves beyond such grace, and as Celeste watched Sebastian cradle their daughter with infinite tenderness, she knew with absolute certainty that every moment of pain, every year of isolation, every instance of courage required to remove her veil had been leading her toward this abundant life, and that the scars she bore were not marks of damage, but rather maps of the journey that had brought her home. 5 years had passed since that first fateful ball, where a scarred duke had crossed a crowded ballroom to approach a veiled woman standing in the shadows. And on this particular autumn afternoon that echoed the season of their meeting, Celeste stood in the rose garden of Blackwood Hall, watching her daughter Hope examine the blooms with fearless curiosity, the child's small fingers reaching toward thorns without hesitation, while Celeste smiled at this evidence that they had succeeded in raising a soul unafraid of the world's sharp edges. And across the garden Sebastian knelt beside their daughter, his scarred face animated with joy as he taught her to identify different varieties of roses, his deep voice patient and warm in a way that still made Celeste's heart swell with wonder at the transformation love had wrought in both of them. The scars that marked Celeste's face and neck remained as visible as ever, the burn marks that had once defined her entire existence, now simply part of the landscape of her features, no more significant than the color of her eyes or the curve of her smile, and she understood with profound gratitude that this was what healing truly meant, not the erasure of wounds, but the integration of them into a life so full and rich that they became merely one thread in a larger tapestry rather than the entire pattern. When Sebastian caught her eye across the garden and smiled at her with that particular expression that still held traces of the wonder he had shown on the morning she first removed her veil, she felt the wordless communication that flowed between them after years of deep partnership, and in that shared glance lived the entire journey they had traveled together, from isolation to intimacy, from arrangement to authentic love, from hiding to the courage of being fully seen and fully known. As evening settled over the estate with the gentle grace of autumn twilight, they gathered in the library where so much of their early connection had been forged. Hope nestled between them on the settee, as Sebastian read aloud from a storybook, and when the child looked up at Celeste with innocent curiosity and asked about the marks on her mother's face, Celeste felt no shame or hesitation as she explained in simple, truthful words that these were marks of survival, evidence of a fire she had lived through, scars that told a story of courage and healing rather than damage or loss. And Hope reached up to trace the marks with gentle fingers before declaring them beautiful because they were part of her mama. And in that moment Celeste understood that they had truly broken the cycle of shame she had once believed herself condemned to carry forward. Dear listener, if you have followed this journey from beginning to end, then you have witnessed a truth that extends far beyond one woman's veil or one man's war scars. For this story speaks to the universal human experience of hiding the parts of ourselves we fear will make us unlovable, of building walls around wounded hearts in the mistaken belief that isolation offers more safety than vulnerability ever could, and the revolutionary discovery that true acceptance, the kind that heals rather than merely tolerates, comes not from perfection, but from the courage to reveal our authentic selves to those worthy of the gift. The world will always contain those who judge by surfaces, who recoil from anything that challenges their narrow definitions of beauty or worth. But the world also contains those rare souls who see past scars of every kind, to the courage and resilience and hard-won wisdom that suffering can forge, and the key lies not in changing ourselves to meet the world's shallow standards, but in developing the discernment to recognize which voices deserve our attention and which we must learn to let fade into insignificance. For those of you carrying your own hidden wounds, whether they mark your skin or live invisibly in the chambers of your heart, may you find the courage Celeste discovered to remove whatever veil you have constructed. May you encounter the patient love Sebastian offered that sees your worth when you struggle to see it yourself, and may you come to understand that your scars, rather than disqualifying you from love and connection and abundant life, may actually be the very things that prepare you to appreciate these gifts with a depth that those who have never suffered cannot fully comprehend. Rest well in the knowledge that healing is possible, that isolation is a choice rather than a destiny, and that somewhere in this world there exists the possibility of being seen completely and loved entirely, not in spite of your wounds, but with full acknowledgement of everything you have survived to become who you are. This has been a story from Love in Bloom Tales, and if it has touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey from hiding to wholeness, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below and to subscribe so that more stories of transformation and healing might find their way to you, and to carry forward into your own life the gentle truth that you are worthy of being seen, scars and all, and that your courage to live authentically might become the very thing that gives another person permission to do the same.